All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started with today's breakfast. Welcome back. If it's not your first time here with the Environmental Professionals Network, welcome back to the 4-H Center. Hopefully you've well adjusted to the new parking protocol here. Lots of things are changing at Ohio State within the past day, and one of those things is our parking portal here for the 4-H Center. So hopefully that went all right for all of you guys. But good morning, everybody. My name is Harrison Freed. I'm the program director for the Environmental Professionals Network. It's great to have you all here today, both in person and online on our live stream. I want to mention that EPN every March for the past 11 years focuses on a water-related program in partnership with WAMO, the Water Management Association of Ohio. I know we have Sarah Saylor, who's the administrative professional for WAMO in the registration area. We're really grateful to work with WAMO to bring together folks who work in all sectors related to water for these annual programs to focus on burgeoning issues related to how we protect one of our most important natural resources here in Ohio. So, like I mentioned, this is the 11th year in a row that we've worked with WAMO, which really pays, I think, a nice testament to a lot of collaboration and support over the years. So, a quick overview for what you're going to see today and what you're going to hear today. There are 4 different speakers during today's breakfast who will talk about international to state to local perspectives on flood risk management. And I think you're going to get a nice balance of how communities can grapple with changes to climate risk, exacerbated rainfall events in terms of the severity of these rainfall events, and at the same time, limitations to federal funding sources. So the question then becomes, how do communities prepare for that changing risk environment? And our 4 speakers this morning, I think, are going to do a beautiful job to illustrate the methods of those communities that they can, utilize to be able to navigate that new risk environment. So, on your tables, you'll find a brochure with information about all of our speakers. You can reference that information as you want to know more about their credentials and their work experience. I also want to mention that today would not be possible without several different sponsors who have generously funded the Environmental Professionals Network. As a result of their gifts, we've been able to offer free attendance to students for all of our EPN breakfasts, as well as free live stream attendance for anyone, so that they're able to access this continuing education programming from wherever they are. We know it's dark out this morning with daylight savings, so thank you all in person for braving it despite the darkness. So here are our sponsors. We have the Sustainability Institute at Ohio State. We have the Facilities Operations and Development Department at Ohio State as well. Ohio State Energy Partners, NG North America. We have the Division of Wildlife. Chris Elwood, who's here with Edward Jones. Delco Water Company. And of course, WAMO, who's a sponsor of ours as well. So let's give a round of applause to all these sponsors. We couldn't do it without them. So one quick announcement before I go, which I think is very exciting. In just over a month, EPN will launch EPN Connect, which is our new platform that is designed to help facilitate relationships and connections between environmental people throughout Ohio. And I say environmental people despite the fact that we're called the Environmental Professionals Network, because this is a platform that's designed to facilitate connections between people who have full-time jobs in the environmental space, residents, community members who do this part-time, students, researchers, teachers. All of the above are relevant audience members who might benefit from accessing EPN Connect. It's designed to showcase expertise areas across all of Ohio's 88 counties. It's designed to showcase events that 700 plus organizations that do environmental work have and want people to know about. It's designed to showcase jobs, internships, board openings, really anything that you might want to know to be able to get involved within the environmental space here throughout all of Ohio's 88 counties. So really excited about this. It's going to launch on Earth Day, so a little bit over a month. So stay tuned. Now, today I have the pleasure of introducing Eve Kelley. Eve Kelley is an undergraduate student here in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Science, and she'll be talking a little bit today about the program agenda. She'll introduce some of the program speakers, and she is here to provide the student perspective. We have a lot of students in the room, so we encourage professionals and students to interact together while you are here. So without further ado, I'll give it up to Eve. Thank you.
All right, right, good morning, everyone. My name is Kelley, and I'm a second-year student here at Ohio State University. I'm studying sustainable plant systems with a specialization in horticulture and marine science as well. I'm also not the secretary, but the involvement chair of the executive board of TerrAqua, which is a student organization that's associated with WAMO, one of today's co-hosts. On behalf of TerrAqua and all the students here today, I'm so excited to open today's event on flood risk management in rural communities. For those wondering, our club TerrAqua is a student-run organization that gives students hands-on experience in their field, provides networking opportunities, tours of relevant facilities, and cultivates a community with shared interest in aquatic sciences. As someone who grew up on the Hocking River and whose parent is a member of the Hocking River Commission, and whose community has been dealing with the river flooding as recently as in the past week, I am passionate about today's topic, and I'm sure that many of the students here today are as well. I mainly study plant science and food systems, but my interest in conservation and aquatic biology has brought me here today, and I know that together, with our many unique skills and personal histories, we can find solutions. With our shared experiences, I'm sure we can all find a way to connect with our speakers, who will discuss the structural engineering and community education strategies to mitigate the risk of severe floods in rural communities throughout Ohio. More than that, I look forward to learning how students like me can get involved. Networking events such as these can be intimidating, but there's a reason why we're all here today. My role as involvement chair in TerrAqua is to find different ways to encourage my peers to take a chance with us and join in on our club events. Because I believe that whether you're studying engineering, environmental sciences, or horticulture, you can always find a way to connect with others. Today, I would like to challenge my fellow students in the room, use those conversation prompt cards that you were given when you checked in, and talk to someone new. Additionally, I would like to ask the professionals in this room to seek out students and help them start the conversation. Now, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Kelsey Best, who is an assistant professor here at The Ohio State University, and who will provide invaluable insight on flood risk management from a global to a local perspective. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Best. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve, and good morning, everybody. Let's see. Oh, something happened. Okay, it's working. I didn't touch it and it changed. That was magical. All right, hi, everyone. My name is Kelsey Best. I'm an assistant professor here at Ohio State University. I have a joint appointment in civil, environmental, and geodetic engineering and city and regional planning. And part of what I was asked to do today was to kind of set the high-level stage as our other speakers will continue to drill down into the Ohio and the local context. So I want to present a framework that I use to think about a range of climate-related risks, how they relate with infrastructure and community well-being, and then I want to present a few examples of specific work that my team and I have been looking at to hopefully just seed some ideas and maybe some questions during the Q&A. So to start us off, we know at a high level that human-induced climate change has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people beyond natural climate variability. What really is a foundation of my work is taking this a step further. We also know that across sectors and regions, it's the most vulnerable people and systems that are disproportionately affected. And one thing I love about the IPCC reports is they give us confidence intervals on all of their statements. So we know this with a high degree of confidence, that really there are disproportionate impacts on the most vulnerable people and systems globally and within our own communities. So when I talk about climate resilience, I'm really referring to the capacity to prepare for, withstand, and recover from, and then ideally adapt to increase resilience to the effects of climate change. And those effects, of course, vary locally, but this applies to flooding as well. And we know in many contexts and in central Ohio, across Ohio, that increased flood risks are one of those really serious effects that we expect to see with increasing global climate change. So then this is a framework that I use for much of my work to think about how overlapping inequities can interact with that concept of resilience. So the first sphere here is we know that historically marginalized or disadvantaged groups often face higher physical exposure to those effects of climate change. So for example, in the US, in many contexts, low-income communities are more likely to live in or around floodplains. And as someone in urban planning, I also like to point out that this is not by accident. In many cases, this is by design. So historical policies, things like redlining, exclusionary zoning, segregation, have pushed marginalized communities into these high-risk areas. At the same time, it's often these same groups and these same communities that have access to fewer resources to be able to respond and recover when there is a physical hazard. And again, this is because of historic discrimination, marginalization. And when we think about resources to respond and recover, we can think about economic resources, of course, but also things like social networks or ability to participate in decision-making and political processes. And then lastly, the engineering side of my joint appointment, we also think about infrastructure. And again, it's often these same communities that have underinvestments in infrastructure. So the physical infrastructure itself is often lower quality, maybe built with poor materials to lower code standards, et cetera. So that means that the infrastructure itself is also more susceptible to higher degrees of damage when there is a climate-related event, such as flooding. So I like to think about the intersection of these three spheres, again, across and within communities to really center equity in the way we think about these problems. And one reason that this is important is we can think about this kind of general resilience curve. So we have two communities here, one in green and one in blue. You can see that they're starting at different points. The green community has a higher level of general well-being than the blue. And then we can introduce some kind of disaster or climate-related shock, like a flooding event. And we can see that both of them experience damage or a decrease in their well-being. And then thinking about those three spheres of inequities, they're going to influence the ability of those communities to recover over time as well. And so really what I'm concerned about is this widening gap across communities. So you can see if we're not thinking about equity in disaster recovery and response, we really risk those communities continuing to diverge. The community that started off in a poorer position, the blue community, is ending up even lower on that spectrum. So now thinking more specifically about flooding, that's why we're all here. We know that like other climate-related hazards, flooding is also not evenly distributed across the US or within communities. I like this figure a lot. It shows a combination of flood exposure and social vulnerability. So those things like low income, racial and ethnic minorities, maybe elderly populations, characteristics that make a community more susceptible to flooding. And you can see across the US, there's a pretty stark geographic pattern here with especially communities in the Southeast having both high flood exposure and high social vulnerability. But we can think about how that distribution looks different in different places. And then, of course, this high-level picture is also likely obscuring finer scale inequities that probably exist within those communities. So I want to very quickly talk about a few specific examples, again, hopefully just to seed some thought and maybe some ideas for the Q&A. So one project that I have is looking specifically at public housing residents and flood risk. So we know by eligibility, public housing residents are socially marginalized. They're low income. They're more likely to be racial minorities, more likely to be elderly or have a disability. There's also some evidence that public housing residents have already experienced disproportionate flood damage. For example, in Hurricane Harvey in Houston, this was the case with public housing residents, and discrimination in post-disaster recovery. So we can use that framework of a triple exposure to specifically look at the distribution of flood risk and public housing across the U.S. So HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, publishes physical inspection scores of all of their owned and operated public housing units. So this can give us a sense of the physical quality of that housing. And these inspection scores include a wide range of factors, everything from is there graffiti on the exterior to does the elevator work, but they're aggregated into a single score, and that score is from 0 to 100. And this allows HUD to classify this public housing as high-performing, standard, which is 60 to 90, or troubled, which is a score of less than 60. And importantly, those troubled housing units, they're supposed to enter then a remedial plan to try to increase that score at least to the standard level. But we can see across the U.S. that these scores are decreasing over time, which suggests a decline in the physical quality of this public housing, and that perhaps HUD is having a hard time keeping up with maintenance of these facilities. So we can actually map where some of these kind of troubled public housing units might be. So this map shows all of those public housing units that are owned and operated by HUD. And importantly, if you look at the red triangles, this is where we're mapping those places that are in a floodplain that are scoring in that troubled physical quality zone and are also within communities that are socially marginalized. So here, these are locations in communities that are primarily people of color. And we can look at that distribution, and we can look across different dimensions. So we can look at communities with more elderly populations, and you can see that those red triangles shift. Or we can look with more of a intersectional approach and think about communities that are primarily people of color who are also living in poverty. And again, you can see these kinds of troubled areas move around. So using that framework, we see that in many cases, residents of public housing might face this kind of triple exposure. We do other analyses to show that there is a significant relationship between flood risk and lower quality housing. Thinking about policy applications then, HUD has established guidelines for new public housing projects that have certain resilience standards, but importantly, those do not apply to these existing projects. So we're hoping that this kind of analysis could be useful to identify those areas that should be invested in order to reduce flood risk with an equitable mindset. And then the last example that I'll give, I know we are nowhere near the coast, but my group also thinks about coastal flooding and sea level rise. And we can think about another impact of this kind of flooding as inundation of homes. So we know from projections that across the U.S. coastal areas, as many as 1 million, likely more homes might be flooded or inundated by the year 2100. Something that I think about a lot across contexts, including internationally, is then how those kinds of risks and impacts could interact with mobility or migration decisions. So if we project out how those flooded households might decide to move, we can think about potential forced displacement of millions more people in the United States. Quick shameless plug, if anyone is very interested in climate migration, I did write a book about this that recently came out, and you can check that out. So I did my postdoc at the University of Maryland, and this is a great place to think about these kinds of increasing flood risks. So across the eastern shore of Maryland, there's increasing sunny day flooding, which, as you can see in the picture, means that there's no precipitation. It's a clear day, but there is roadway flooding, and that's completely tidally driven. As sea levels rise, the tides are rising as well, and you get this kind of frequent and repeat flooding. And this has gotten to the point that in some communities, shift work is actually scheduled around the tides rather than the traditional 9 to 5, so that people can get to and from work without running into this kind of flooding. So the Department of Transportation here is thinking about what this means for roadway access. And currently, or historically, their approach to responding to this has been to continue to elevate roadways to try to keep up with those increasing flood risks, to the point that some segments of road around this area have as much as 6 feet of pavement. They're continuing to add on to try to keep up, but there's an increased recognition that that is really not a sustainable approach. So they're having serious conversations about where they might need to divest in transportation systems. But importantly, there are a lot of open questions about what that might actually mean for residents in terms of their access to essential services and in terms of their long-term well-being. So thinking about flood risk and displacement, one of the indirect ways that we could see in different contexts flood risk interacting with displacement is interacting with gentrification. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the general concept of gentrification, which is that higher income groups move into a low income area, displacing those original residents. There's an emerging field that is looking at how climate change and climate-related risks could interact with those kinds of displacements. I like to credit this woman, Paulette Richards, who is a local activist in Miami, who coined this term because she was seeing it in her community. So there are a couple pathways, depending on where we look, of how this could happen. We could see wealthier people moving into low-risk areas and driving up prices there and displacing those residents, which is what we see in some communities on the ground in Miami. So I worked with a student here, Mia. This is a map of Miami, and you can see Miami has this naturally occurring high elevation zone that also happens to align with some historically redlined areas. So I'd like to end just by taking you to one specific community in Miami, which is Little Haiti, that falls on that high elevation ridge. So Little Haiti, as the name suggests, is ethnically Haitian. It's also largely low income, people of color, but it has this rich and vibrant cultural history. So these are some images that I took when we visited Little Haiti. And at the same time, if you talk to residents of Little Haiti, they will say that developers have been knocking on their doors, trying to buy their properties from underneath them because they're in that high elevation zone. So when other parts of the city flood, Little Haiti doesn't flood. And developers are starting to pick up on that signal. So this is a multi-million-dollar development project that has broken ground in Little Haiti. This is clearly going to disrupt the cultural landscape of that neighborhood, and residents are very concerned about the potential displacement and that they might be displaced into higher risk areas. So in conclusion, I've done a lot of work in Bangladesh. This is an image from Bangladesh. Thinking about these relationships with mobility, I know there's a lot of interest in Ohio potentially being a climate haven, so maybe a place that people will move to. But we need to be thinking about what kind of strain that could put on our infrastructure, on our systems, and also thinking about how that kind of mobility could change this distribution of risk. So just to pull it all together, we know that flooding will continue to interact with infrastructure in complex ways, and the effects will not be felt equitably. I argue that we should be centering justice in these conversations, and if any students are interested in working on these kinds of projects, please let me know. All right, thank you so much.
All right, good morning. First of all, I'm just super excited to be here and to be joining everybody. I am Chad Berginnis, Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and there are a few faces in this room that I recognize, and just kind of a funny story. Boris Slogar, who many of you know, I saw him from across the way as I walked in, and I was like, And he's like, Chad, and I'm like, who is this guy? It's been a long time since I've seen him, but no, I've spent a lot of my career working in the state of Ohio, but I took a detour to join the Association of State Floodplain Managers staff in Madison, Wisconsin back in 2011. Recently moved back in the summer of 2022 and doing kind of the remote work thing that way. But I'm excited to be here, one, because flood risk is a passion of mine. It's been a career-long focus, and I'm kind of on that other side of the curve now. I'm one of those older folks speaking on these folks. I've been on these issues. I've been doing this for about 33 years or so now. But secondly, this is my alma mater. So I'm happy to be back here, certainly on campus, even though it's changed quite a lot. Dr. Best's presentation, I've taken some pictures and I want to follow up on a few things, but I think it sets up nicely a different angle that I want to talk about when it comes to rural flood resilience that way. And that is really focusing kind of on this data aspect, because it's something that I think if we're not handling it carefully, it's something that leads us to wrong results and wrong outcomes. But first, I just want so you understand where our perspective is as organizationally and kind of where I'm coming from. The Association of State Floodplain Managers is a national nonprofit organization. We're dedicated to reducing flood losses in the nation, ending misery, and protecting and recognizing the fact that floodplains are important natural resources. We do that through education, policies, research, and activities. That way, and we run the nation's certified floodplain manager program. We develop tools and publications and resources so that practicing floodplain managers can do their jobs better. And we build collaborative partnerships. But probably what we're most known for is a lot of our policy work at the federal and state level when it comes to flood risk management. And it has been certainly a very interesting year or so in the flood policy world. But when I think about social vulnerability and hazards for rural populations, there's a few things that come to mind, and probably there'll be a few repeating themes here. And I think it was just talked about in terms of a couple characteristics. One of those is that we typically have low capacities at the community or the tribal level. And that goes from staffing expertise to even consultants. So let's say you're a small rural community and you come into a couple $1 million to do a flood hazard mitigation project. Good luck in trying to find qualified consultants that could actually help you implement that project, whether it be a home elevation contractor or being the engineering experts that you need to help implement your particular project. We also tend to see lower levels of funding, whereas larger, more urban areas have the ability to generate their own tax revenue, have other revenue sources, grants writers on staff and everything. In rural communities, you may be scraping and scrimping together literally a couple years worth of community development block grant funding to help provide non-federal match to a particular project that way. And there's opportunity costs for that, right? Maybe a village doesn't get its fire truck because you're actually matching a hazard mitigation project. Higher levels of poverty work often further away, so transportation actually is a significant issue because we see a lot of commuters typically going. Early in my career, I was a county planning director in Perry County, Ohio, and so in Perry County, you always had the stream of headlights going north in the morning, where folks from even south of Perry County were going into the Columbus area for work, and then they'd spend that hour and a half commute going back that way. A lot of folks, disabled, elderly, medical needs, and in talking and actually working with folks in flood mitigation projects, it ranges from, hey, this is the family home, to I got married in my living room. And so we're just not willing to leave these situations there. But maybe one of the biggest points and one of the most underappreciated is that hazards data is often limited. And this is something that is critically important. Now, in our flood reduction world, the last administration was kind of the golden years when it came to funding, attention, and those kinds of things. And yet I'll also be a little provocative and say they were somewhat reckless too, in terms of we were using tools and approaches and things that I don't believe we understood the outcomes that they were driving to. So, there's a couple things in terms of federal disaster and recovery and resilience programs that you think about. One, do you have an allocation versus a competition? There's a couple different schools of thought here. Allocation, where each community gets money or each state gets money that's distributed to communities based on their unique needs, versus some national competition where, hey, we want to make sure that the dollars are going to the very best projects in the nation. What kind of outcomes does that result in? We had a lot of funding and a lot of national competitions. Secondly, though, how are data sets used? And I'm, in the field of hazards and vulnerability and everything, there has been, over the last, I would say, 20 years or so, an enormous amount of new kind of national data sets. One that we use a lot in the flood world is something called the National Risk Index. It's something that FEMA first started using, and then it spread to other agencies to help identify and quantify risks and information that way. And so the National Risk Index takes a look at all the different hazards in a community, comes up with a composite score, and then your score is relative to other counties or communities or areas to give a relative risk across the nation. I remember when it first rolled out in some of the first national analysis, the headlines were very interesting. Some small community in the state of Washington, I think, was like the riskiest community in the country. And it isn't the standard places you would think from a flooding standpoint, like, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, those kinds of things. And so we had this proliferation of data sets, social vulnerability indexes and so forth. And then these indexes were built into tools, so they started layering on top of each other. It's an important point I'll get back to. But then finally, what is the federal role versus the state role? And one of the things, again, ASFPM is known for our policy work. We work on federal legislation. We work at the state level, but one of the truisms seem to be is that if the feds come in with buckets full of money, the state typically will pull back and say, okay, you can do it. We can spend our money elsewhere, give tax cuts, do all these kinds of things. But typically we'll see the state pulling back as opposed to contributing and trying to help solve the problem proactively that way. So one of the honors that I had in my career most recently is I was an appointee to the FEMA National Advisory Council. And we started digging into this data issue, and a report that probably has not seen the light of day nearly enough because it literally was posted online for about 60 days and then taken off. But it was the 2024 NAC report. I was on the climate change subcommittee, and as part of that, championed a couple of these recommendations here. But what we were finding is that the use of large data sets was not being done correctly in the context of some of these programs. And so when you had a program, for instance, the FEMA BRIC program, it was their big resilience program that had billions of dollars in there. It was used to make funding decisions, cost sharing, technical assistance decisions. It was being used inappropriately. Because when you dig really deep down into what it was supposed to be used for, it acknowledges we have vast data gaps in the country. From a flood standpoint, we have areas even here in Ohio that are not studied. Nationally, about a third of our floodplains are mapped. The way the National Risk Index talks about unmapped areas, it assumes there's no risk because it doesn't understand the trade-offs and decisions that were made when flood mapping and funding and priorities occur. And that is simply, we don't have enough resources to map everywhere in the country, so we prioritize, and we prioritize urban areas. So think about that a little bit. If you're using this index for funding decisions or even eligibility, and yet that same data set in rural areas basically said, oh, you have no risk, what do you think that leaves? Where does that leave communities? And so that recommendation 06 was really meant to to tell FEMA they need to have appropriate uses and have a new policy there. But then also we had met some great colleagues, and it was one of the colleagues from America Samoa that said, hey, you think in the continental US you have it bad, in the territories we had nothing. And so there was a secondary recommendation given that especially in territorial areas and things like that, we just need some basic data to begin with. So I want to bring it back to then at least an Ohio example, and this is a community, again, in Perry County I'd worked with after a significant flood in 1998, but hopefully to kind of illustrate where some of these data set issues lie. So Corning is a community right now, a little bit under 500 folks, household income pretty low, and in fact, I believe one of the statistics that I read has about a 40% poverty rate or so that way. So by any number of assessments, it would be considered a low to moderate income type community. 70% of the homes were flooded in the 98 flood, very flash flood prone, multiple historic flooding events. The National Risk Index said that the flood risk in Corning was very low. It says it today. Now, this is a little bit different thing. Why is that? Well, it's because it's done on a census tract level. And so the census tract in this area is about 3,700 people. Corning's only 478. You have a dilution factor here that basically, for this small rural community, it gets penalized for being in a larger census tract because the index is not good enough to suss out and understand what the risk actually is. And so I bring this up, and I think it's a germane discussion for this morning because we have a combination of not only professionals in the room, but also academia, young researchers that are looking into these things. And one of the things that I think we have to understand is to make sure that we're using these indexes appropriately, make sure we understand where the gaps are, and build them in such a way that we aren't penalizing rural communities. We need more data and more capacity in rural communities. ASFPM did a cost model several years ago, about 2022, and it would cost between $3 billion and $10 billion to do flood mapping for the rest of the country where we don't have it. But our average annual flood losses in this country right now are exceeding $40 billion a year. So just to give a juxtaposition there. We must never use things like NRI to be used for eligibility or funding decisions, to prioritize funding or for cost share. It's important that we have these for things like research and planning and being able to do an overall level assessments. But we can absolutely, and we have demonstrated the capacity for using these things in a wrong way. And then have the ability to include data-poor rural communities in national competitive programs. I think Dr. Best mentioned HUD and some of their programs. So one of the things I like about HUD programs is that if you don't meet their threshold for low to moderate income in their community development block grant program, you can do an income survey for a smaller defined project area and submit that and change the data. FEMA, on the other hand, with the NRI, expressly prohibited any better local data because they said somehow it would upset the continuity of the national data set. So a couple other things then, and just kind of zooming out from the data piece of it, is building state and local capacity to mitigate flood risk. Folks, we are in, at least right now, an era of less federal assistance and less federal help that way. And there are states that have proven models to do this. The state of Minnesota, which by no means is a big urban state, wealthy state, a lot of rural areas, but from 1988 to 2018 has provided over $500 million for flood mitigation in that state. They have the nation's oldest flood mitigation program, and they chip away at it year after year after year. I know the good folks at Ohio EMA and some state folks are trying to get the state of Ohio to build one of those, and it's my hope someday that we'll be able to get there. We also need to have strong state capacity both in hazard mitigation and floodplain management. We need to have strong planning, policies, and requirements as well. And part of that is having better standards. And so I'm going to wrap up with basically, hopefully I'm not crossing into Alicia's territory too much, but I'll just say the standards we use in the country as the base are over 50 years old. We need better flood mapping, and we have to recognize that building this capacity is simply something that's just very hard to do. So again, in 15 minutes, didn't get to go into in depth in a lot of that, but I wanted to bring this data issue up because a real problem that I've seen over the last couple years is we accept these data sets as something that are just a given, and then we build tools on top of those, and all they do is they multiply the errors, and that is a huge problem for rural communities. Thank you very much.
Less tall than Chad, so I'll adjust that. Good morning. My name is Alicia Silverio. I am with ODNR's Floodplain Management Program, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about what it's like to work with rural communities from the state's perspective. And in my almost 27 years of meeting with communities throughout the state, and urban communities, rural communities, mid-sized communities, what is the experience of the rural community in regard to flood risk management? So let me see if I can. All right. So how do most of Ohio's communities manage flood risk? So we have about 753 participating communities in Ohio. And what that means is most communities in Ohio are basing their flood risk management on the National Flood Insurance Program. And the NFIP, which we refer to the National Flood Insurance Program as, is the basis for floodplain management for those communities, because it is this program creates the minimum federal standards that communities must adopt and implement to participate in this program. And so to participate, they must adopt these standards and administer a permitting process. And so the reason that they do this, because I will be very honest with you, most of these communities see floodplain management as a burden, even though they do know and understand their own flood risk, is that it's a very complex program, but it has some benefits. This program provides additional forms of disaster assistance to the communities, which is very important, and it enables residents to obtain federal flood insurance to help protect themselves against flood losses. So that is why most communities throughout the state of Ohio do participate in this program. And so when they are utilizing the NFIP, they are confronted with challenges on a day-to-day basis. And the challenges that most of these rural communities are facing is that they are under-resourced local government offices. Most of the villages or even small-scale rural cities or county unincorporated areas do not have the sufficient staff. And when I say sufficient, they don't have the number of staff, or the staff may not be trained in all the aspects they need to effectively or comprehensively take care of all the responsibilities that they are confronted with as a local government. But they are doing their very best that they can. These counties and communities are less densely populated in these rural areas. So that means that they have a reduced tax base. That reduced tax base provides less funding to support those local governmental needs and the local community needs. And so it's very difficult for them to then prioritize staff, acquiring more staffing when they have to worry about fixing roadways. They have to worry about other issues within their communities to keep their residents safe. These smaller rural communities are often faced with population decline. That is a reality of what they are confronted with. Chad gave us an excellent example in Corning, and we are seeing that throughout the state as well. I mentioned that the staff they are typically understaffed. And there's just not enough funding to address all the needs. I was speaking with a community that I work with on a regular basis, and they said that they had to let 3 people go so that their local government did not dissolve. So that is the small buffer with which they are operating on an their annual budgets. Floodplain officials in community. So each community that participates in this federal program, the NFIP, must designate an official that's responsible for implementing floodplain management. That person's typically referred to as a floodplain manager or a floodplain administrator. And in a lot of these smaller or rural communities, the floodplain manager is often the mayor or the clerk or the village or city manager. And so when they took that position, they didn't really, floodplain management was not at the forefront of what they thought that they would be doing, but it is an additional responsibility that they might be taking on. Even if a community has a building or a zoning inspector, these staff may not know or understand the complex and National Flood Insurance Program because the NFIP is very complex. And Chad was talking about how we need to look forward and we need to look towards advanced regulations. And the standards that we have are 50 years old, but yet communities are still challenged with meeting those basic standards that are 50 years old. And I'm not saying we shouldn't look forward and move forward, but it is still very challenging for these communities as it is today to implement these basic federal requirements on a local level because the program is very complex. It's comprised of mapping and data and regulations and insurance. And a lot of that takes experience with it to understand it and help their residents navigate those processes. The federal maps, as Chad mentioned, do not depict all flood risk. They show the areas that have been studied. So we may have other areas in these communities that have not been studied for flood risk because they weren't prioritized for study because they were less densely populated areas. So that is a reality of communities that are in rural areas. They just don't have, as recent or detailed of mapping as many other urban areas. In fact, our 5 counties in Ohio that do not have digital data are all rural counties. And we have been pressing for years to try and update this data so these communities had a better representation of their flood risk so they could make better decisions moving forward. Let's see. And so what are some of these challenges that are faced by rural communities? And so they also have older populations. So these older residents, the reality of getting older, as I am finding out, is you have basically as, we see that there are more health problems associated with older populations. And so their resiliency as a population or their ability to respond or recover from these disaster situations is decreasing over time. These populations may not have, whether they're older or they are of an average age, they may not have the financial reserves to recur from damaging events or loss of income. And so Dr. Best was talking to us about how a lot of the flood risk areas are occupied by lower income residents. They have lower income housing and they have maybe properties that have not been maintained as well, or they may not be as of high value. And so, how did these rural communities, meet these challenges on a day-to-day basis? Because there may not be financial reserves to recover from damaging events or a loss of income resulting from a flood event. A lot of these rural communities, and if you are fortunate enough to be from one, have beautiful older homes or generational homes, but they were built at a time before flood protection laws or mapping was in place. So they might have been built in locations that were at high risk. And so to reduce the risk associated with these structures takes major rehab or reconstruction. And so that may not be feasible for a lot of folks with their income or the time it would take or for the structure. And then there's also, we're confronted with at the state level, and this is anywhere you go in this state, property owner opposition to regulations. It is often a very challenging thing for community officials to implement regulations that their residents are opposed to. And even if a community is flood prone and they understand that the regulations are intended to reduce the flood risk associated with their structures, those residents are often opposed to having to implement them locally. We see increased frequency and severity of weather events. That's occurring in rural and urban areas. The public perception of risk is another factor we're confronted with on every day. Aging infrastructure is a very significant problem. You can see in this illustration, we have a levee that is flooded on the wrong side of the levee. We have the affordability of flood insurance. Even though communities participate in the NFIP, we see that, if they own their home or they have a generational home, they may not be able to afford flood insurance to protect themselves for future flood events. Large-scale flood control projects are often going to exceed a cost benefit, which there's really not funding out there for these projects. And even if we do have flood control projects locally, it's very costly to maintain. How do rural communities confront these challenges? Well, this is not an easy question to ask because there's very limited federal mitigation funding. And with the situation that we're facing today, with mitigation funding, how that will be distributed or implemented in the future, we have questions about that. There are very limited opportunities for mitigation funding. Typically, federal declarations are what trigger the release of federal mitigation funds in communities, and you have to have a large-scale disaster meeting a certain financial threshold to achieve that. And many devastating events in Ohio particularly do not achieve that threshold. And it may be difficult to find a local funding match. Locally generated funding sources may be an option. I know that in Hancock County and Findlay, they did a limited sales tax for a period of years to develop a fund to implement mitigation in the Blanchard River area region. So they are trying to tackle their flood risk that way. And small, localized approaches, trying to address individual issues as they can. We recommend, seeking out those opportunities when possible, addressing them as best they can. Obviously, comprehensive and regional approaches are wonderful to think about, but they are very difficult to implement, and that's a certain reality. And I'm not saying we should ignore those, but I think that we also need to look at what's achievable in comparison to bigger plans as well. How can we generate a bigger plan but do what's achievable on a day-to-day basis? And then sometimes rural communities are just unable to confront these challenges. They will continue to deal with flooding season after season or event after event. They will clean up as best they can, and they will try to continue on as best they can to neighbors helping neighbors, community governments trying to support their residents as best they can and provide the best community services that they can, reallocating resources as best they can when those events arise. And so it really does take the creativity and the just the overall effort and dedication of those community officials to help their residents as those events occur. So what does the future of flood risk management look like? I know it seems that I might be giving you a very somber outlook, but I am optimistic. Even though we're looking at news reports and we're waiting for information from the FEMA Council review report, I know that there are dedicated people working in these communities trying to help their populations. I know that there are students coming out of educational institutions like Ohio State. I know that there are current professionals out there that are really dedicated to finding solutions. So that helps create my optimism, even though we have challenges on a day-to-day basis. We are seeing that, discussion about more responsibility allocated towards states. We are seeing more discussion about more responsibility allocated towards communities. And as Ohio, we have to look at how we are going to address those responsibilities. And so once we find out and receive more information about what changes will be sent our way or implemented, then we can step up to figure out how can we best support our communities in Ohio, and how can they work together, how these communities can work with their residents to best address these needs. And we're going to have to get creative. We're going to have to, really dig in and try to find some realistic solutions. We're looking at impacts to federal disaster assistance, and so we're looking at all these things on the future, on the horizon, the availability of mitigation funding, and we're looking to see what's coming. And once we have more information, we will continue to try to find the solutions that help our communities as best as possible. I just want to thank you for your time. I thank you for the things that you will do to reduce flood risk in the future. And I will hand it over to Linda.
Hello, everyone. Unlike some of the people that have already spoken here, this is a perfect segue for who I am and what I've done. I am not a college graduate. I'm a person that worked in a village office who, after a huge flood event in the village of Hebron in 2012, the mayor goes, "I am not prepared to be the floodplain administrator. Here, you're the stormwater manager. This is yours." So, didn't add to, but they did allow me to start going to training and learning what we needed to do in order to accomplish these goals and help our citizens. I am a lifelong resident of Licking County. I was raised in Buckeye Lake. I experienced flooding. I experienced evacuations, coming back to our home and not having things that we once had because we weren't wealthy. My dad was a factory worker and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. So to me, Licking County is home. And flooding is very important because I've watched people's lives. So having that, I think, brings me to a passion that I didn't know how strongly I had until these things were handed over to me to do. So I am now the stormwater manager for Licking County. I was brought in after the Intel announcement. So as a floodplain, just see it right there. Once that happened in 2021, Licking County was like, oh, okay, we really need some help here. Soil and water conservation districts, I didn't know a lot about, I worked with. I know a lot more about soil and water conservation districts. They're amazing. They're very amazing. So they needed a stormwater manager who was experienced with development, but also had the floodplain and the community in mind. So with that announcement, and as you know, it brought rapid growth and demands that some were already there. The Amazons were already going up. So with all of the extreme data centers, all our rural areas in the county, these are historically agricultural lands, and they were just being taken up. With these different developments, let's make sure what we're on. Licking County commissioners and the groups, we decided as a community that we needed to do something more. We were hit with something that we were like, oh, okay, wow. We already have growth, and now we're going to have a substantial amount of growth. So the commissioners started investing in asking the T.J. Evans Foundation to start the framework. So framework is a big community-based project, one of the largest ones ever taken on. And that was bringing stakeholders in from 15 jurisdictions. So township trustees, cities, villages, all your residents in that area that you see here, that 15 area. And using the T.J. Evans Foundation gave people the ability to say, this is what we want in our community, this is what we like to see, this is what we don't want to see, and helped develop a framework for how we wanted Licking County to develop and what the residents wanted, not just what politicians wanted, not just what cities and villages and planners wanted, but what the people wanted. And one of the things that was really pinpointed in this was conservation. And conservation was a big key. So floodplains, the residents were like, we don't want development in our floodplains. We already struggle with flooding. We want conservation. We want land to be saved. We like farmland preservation, land banks. These smaller community, local, regional areas endeavors became the county's endeavors. So I thought this was one of our best things that we had done. Soil and water conservation districts, there's 88 in Ohio. This conservation focus group gives us a network of support and a diversity of knowledge and experience at our fingertips. Soil and water conservation districts throughout Ohio, we work together. We don't have to have all the answers. Someone has. Somebody's been through it, whether it's Summit or Warren or Noble County. Every county in Ohio has a soil and water conservation district. And all of us talk to each other. We help each other out. We do work for each other when people are out. We send people. Summit right now, as I'm short-staffed, a staff member, Summit Soil and Water has one of their stormwater specialists reviewing our SWIPs, helping us. Do they charge us? No. This is because we're a team. We work together, and it's all about soil and water conservation, so I love it. I fit in this like a glove. So these are our three areas that the Soil and Water District's goal builds on a strong foundation to protect Licking County's natural resources. We've been proactive in creating necessary positions, developed the talent and a passionate team of now 13 staff members. In 2020, there were 4. 2022, there were 6. Now there's 13. That's how much development, that's how much we need the talent resources, such as a watershed specialist. We wanted to make sure water quality was a focus. We have educators, of course, because education is our #1 tool, and our stormwater team. So, and I've been very fortunate to have graduates from Ohio State University. 2 of my newest members, one's from Miami University and one from Ohio State University. So stormwater specialists coming out of your school, and they're very talented. So stormwater focuses on a lot of aspects, but for this, the stormwater team needed to be bigger and more diverse because of the amount of construction that we have in the area. So from construction to post-construction to plan reviews, looking at things that sometimes get overlooked in the county. We're going to look at that property and go, there's a wetland there. May be isolated, but there's a wetland there, we'll need a delineation report. There's a stream going through, you'll need a jurisdictional determination from the Army Corps to say whether it's ephemeral or not. We just don't take your word for it. There's only one organization that can do that. So we manage the permit in Licking County for the commissioners and 10 other local entities that are required to have a stormwater permit, 7 townships and 3 villages. We also manage parts of Newark, Heath, Pataskla, and the village of Hanover's stormwater permit. Busy office. In this diagram that you see, you'll see construction sites. So you'll see some in red, green, yellow. That tells you whether they're complying or not complying. It's an easy, for me, look. And we had, in 2023, 40 active construction sites. In 2024, we had 39. In 2025, we had 46. And I can tell you this year it's going to be more. The plan reviews that we're going through just in this first quarter are massive. So what do we do about that? We also look at the projects. You get an intel, and now those rural roads have to be upgraded. There was no funding for that. It's trying to get these rural roads to be able to handle the infrastructure. So you have construction of asphalt plants, concrete plants, new infrastructure. There's areas that are annexing into cities just to get the services, whether they have water or whether they have sewer, because a lot of our rural area doesn't have those. So it's very accelerated in our housing. Some of the things that we do for stormwater management, some of the things since I've been brought on is updating our regulations. Regulations are important. That's how we run and act and how we're going to handle the development. How we're going to make sure things are following a procedure and that it's not happening to us. We're making sure it happens right. All right? So we're not anti-development, we're pro-proper development. That's how we feel. So we work with the planning, the engineers, building codes, every partner that I can find, every partner, every resource. We meet with the Ohio EPA on a quarterly basis in our office. And this is why it's passionate to me. This is historic flooding. This has been happening. The picture you see in black and white, that's Interstate 70, 1 year after it was constructed in a major floodplain. 1 year, the 1959 flood. It opened in 1958. And this happens annually. Annually, Interstate 70 closes. The off-ramp on the south side, heading east, every year, several times a year, and sometimes it's even the day after they have to close it because the water coming down the watershed. So it's coming from Pataskla, Johnstown area, it comes down through here, and there is no fall in the Buckeye Lake area. It sits. It used to be called the Great Swamp. There was 3 swamps before it, Pigeon Roost, Bloody Run, and we just decided to fill them in and dam them up, and we now have flooding. So once it gets past us, then it goes into Heath, and that's where there's some falls. So there's historic picture is the culvert in 2020 that blew out on State Route 79. I mean, that was the end of trying to figure out commerce. That was huge blow. You've got an industrial park, and you've got I-70 on one side, and you've got Heath and Newark and an industrial park on the other side. And they're like, how are we going to make it around here? If you know the area, you know Thornwood Drive is not a good drive for semi-trucks. So it was very creative and working together. Bringing back to Kelsea, as you could see, here's 2 communities. One senior living community. Do you see the car rooftops in those pictures, that's in Granville. It's not a low-end community, elderly community. This is not a cheap place to live, and yet their cars are underwater. The other communities in Heath, and you can see them evacuating people. I've got pictures of boats. I've been in Hebron where there was no way to get to the elderly community, the Leeds community, past the flooding every year, except for our staff had to wait, our fire department waited up to their waist with a boat to get to the elderly people on the other side and back. 20 minutes, so 20-minute back and forth. That's huge. It would have only taken one stroke or one heart attack, and we would have been in the paper for that. That's not proper floodplain management. That's not proper people management. So here you have the South Licking Watershed Conservancy District. In 2015, I was asked by Judge Marceline to be on the Conservancy District. They wanted to reopen it because of all the flooding and the problems. It had been dormant for years. And I'm like, I'm not the educated person. You might need someone like this or this. And he was like, nope, you're passionate. You'll talk about it. And I do. Because that's the important thing, is the people that live there. So the frequencies of these flooding events, like I said, it's annually. The yellow house picture you have here in Newark, and then one in Granville. I've got some really tough pictures in Hebron that I didn't put in here because those run out of time. So the conservation district came into PAR, and we decided right off the bat that we needed to update an old 1980s plan because the landscape of Licking County did not look the same. So we started with getting grants. We had $2,000 in our checkbook. We started going to commissioners and looking for grant money and assistance however we could get it. Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District and Boris over there was huge help in helping us get our Conservancy District underway. We were able to get a grant to do a flood study in the South Licking Watershed. And as you can see with this map, the pink yellow outlined area is Raccoon Creek part of our watershed, which you can see that has Johnstown, Alexandria, and Granville. Then you go over to just the yellow outline. That's the South Fork Licking River, which is most of Pataskala, some of New Albany, and it comes right down into the Buckeye Lake watershed and back up into Newark. So it's a pretty large watershed. It's small compared to the Muskingum or Miami, but its importance is significant because it's constant. And to try to get the people in the upper reaches of the watershed to understand that they're a part of the watershed and where their water goes is important, and it affects somebody downstream. So this was one of the studies that we had done of the South Fork, and EMH&T was key in putting that together. Then the second part, we got the county commissioners to hire MS consultants to put together a 2D model from Kirkersville to Heath, the big area where it just sits. We need to know how it works in a more defined area because of what we see. Look at the semis. That's Interstate 70. When that closes completely, those trucks are routed to 40. And for a while, it's routed right through Hebron, the school. We've had kids, had to come up with a hazard plan because the kids in the schools were on the buses till 6 p.m. at night because they'd close Interstate 70 and the truck routes. So we had to change and work with the county EMA and state EMA to come up with a plan that one would go 204 and the other way of traffic would go 40 when it floods, because it floods every year. So I'm going to get this hopefully to play and show you Kari's here so she can really advance on this. Do you see how it's filling in? This is showing you the flood event. This is calibrated the 2020 flood. This is showing you the different colors as the depths. Always a time, sorry. Okay. As you can see, that gives us a better understanding. It gives us a better understanding of this area. It's amazing. So for watershed directors such as myself, for a floodplain manager, these types of tools that you brilliant minds have come up with is amazing to me. It helps us understand how the water works, where it's coming in at, and how best to protect our area. One side of this has like the diamond, that's State Route 37. So State Route 37 closes. Interstate 70 is closed clear back as far as 37 because of the flooding. And then you've got 79 and the interstate up here where it runs right along the South Fork Licking River. Amazing study. I'll go through this a little bit quicker because I see we're running out of time. I don't know if you are aware that the National Weather Service predicts flooding based on a clear channel. Does anybody know how many clear channels of streams out there? None. Trees, debris, log jams, that's what you see here. 2020, they found 405 debris fields just in the South Fork Licking watershed. 405. That's huge. So we worked together, thanks to Boris hooking us up with the Silver Jackets, which is the Army Corps working with federal and state agencies. They come together. So our state has one because flooding is the #1 natural hazard in Ohio. Flooding. Remember that. It's huge. Development in your floodplain is not good. They didn't have this debris removal in the budgets at the time. They had stopped developing this. We also, the Army Corps did a 2D model to help with the woody debris and finding out which ones we needed the most removed. Sorry. Then we did the flood study for Raccoon Creek. We did a 2D model as well. You can see this was just the 100-year in an aerial. And this is with the 2D model. These are the hazards. This is showing the inundation here, just a flat, and then this is showing with the topography. So it helps us identify those high areas. What's at risk? This is Newark. You can see the risk in a flood in Newark. Most of those houses are low-income or family homes that have generational. We also did water testing and water quality because of the data centers coming in. So now we have 6 non-point source pollution strategies for 6 of our HUCs and 6 of our HUC 12s and 3 are being developed now so that we can have water quality standards in our area of what can be developed. These are some of our partners. As you can see, it's a lot because I don't have to know everything. I have to know the people that do. I have to develop relationships with those people and those organizations like Alicia, like Chad, like Boris, like your soil and water conservation. Develop those relationships. You want to come into a career, there are careers here. I don't know how, but I am the president of the Ohio Floodplain Managers Association. If you would ask me years ago when I kind of got bombarded by Jerry Brims to serve on the board, but I'm proud. I'm proud that, someone can go from no education to going places where you can get those educations and relying on people to help you through. So develop those strategies and that network. Thank you very much.
Well, that was great. My name is Jeff Sharp. I am have been invited to kind of moderate a Q&A with our panel. I'm so delighted to see how this came together. I was talking to Harrison a year ago, just talking about themes of things that I've been teaching. I teach 3 courses where we iterate through these themes, and sharing just simply this whole concern I have for community adaptation, and particularly for rural Ohio. This came together wonderfully, and I can tell you the EPN statistics on viewership of this session will probably be very high because I will be assigning this in my classes over the coming year, and I've taught this topic 3 times in 3 different classes this year. So I'm going to kick it off with one question, then we'll open up to everybody else. One of the things that becomes apparent to me, and I think Chad noted sort of the rural data question, and then at the very end here, Linda, you did a wonderful job of showing how data is being marshaled in your community. I can't help but think there's a break in here in terms of some communities have tremendous resources and access to this data that they can actually custom and build for it. And some communities, as Chad was pointing out, there's very limited data or it's thin. Even the NRI, I just taught that last week, and that whole website's changed now. I don't know if you've been there in the last 2 months, but the NRI is not served anymore. It's a different structure now. You can still access data, but you cannot get the NRI but you pointed out some very problematic aspects of that data set. So it's justifiably needed to be reconsidered, I think, in some ways, as you noted. But anyway, the point is, what are we going to do about the data that's necessary for the inequity arising from the lack of data between MORPC-served communities or Licking County versus, rural, Appalachia counties? And for any of you, because I think some of you experience more data and some of you experience less.
Well, I think the first thing is just making sure that we take the time right now. Okay, so the NRI isn't up. Let's just reflect though, and make sure that we fix the ways we use it, and also, with AI and big data, it's not going away. But we need to define the rules of the road, not let it be defined for us that way. And then finally, the one thing I didn't talk about, but it will be available nationally, and this is where I think big data, or bigger data sets can be useful. But we are very eagerly waiting for NOAA Atlas 15. And I like to call NOAA Atlas 15 kind of what flood maps are to floodplain managers. NOAA Atlas 15 will be for stormwater managers. So we will no longer be flying blind when we're designing and sizing culverts and bridges and things like that. It is a nationwide rainfall runoff atlas that not only has Volume 1 will have up to today, and Volume 2, still going forward in this administration, as we understand it, will actually have future conditions, which is absolutely amazing. And so that's supposed to come out this spring or summer, and I think that's a game changer. And that data is available everywhere for the whole country, so I think that's important.
Yeah, I'll just speak briefly an example to the data challenge as well. So I'm part of a project in Northeast Ohio across now 9 counties, and we started with the National Risk Index data, knowing about all of these issues with that data. But what we did that I'm excited about to supplement that is we went out and had 10 plus community engagement sessions. So actually sitting down with residents, having them tell us, and in cases point to maps at places that they knew were flooding or where they had experienced flooding. And that's been really promising for us to say, okay, we have this high level data that is useful, but now help us drill down and better understand what that risk actually looks like on the ground. And we've had communities say, wait a minute, your data says I have 0 risk, but my home flooded last year. And it also enables this kind of interesting conversation of, yes, we know that we have these data limitations. You are really the expert of your community. How can we work together to bring those together?
Wonderful. I'm going to open it up for other folks to weigh in here. So we have about 5 minutes so we can maybe answer 1 or 2 questions from the audience.
Thank you, Kelsey. Appreciate the talk today, all of you, actually. Great presentation. You sort of hinted at climate migration into Ohio region, of course. I had the honor of being on the Midwest chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment. It was one topic that at the time, in 2021, we didn't feel there was enough research happening to really talk about. It's one we had to table, but that was, of course, before your book, and I haven't had a chance to read that yet. What do you think what do you think that might look like? Because we get this question a lot from media. What do you think climate migration in Ohio looks like? What are, in a healthy situation, to make that not end up in, exacerbating the inequalities we have here in the state?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. That's a great question. So I would say that we still need a lot more research in this area. And we're not currently seeing that kind of climate migration in the U.S. away from high-risk areas. Actually, if we look at the high-level data, we're still seeing a ton of people moving to places like Florida. But I do think we'll see a shift as these kinds of hazards increase, as we get more repeat events. So what I really advocate for is just more planning in Central Ohio around what kind of scenarios we could see. So thinking about planning for potential population changes now is going to be really important before we do start to see those shifts that I think are coming. So thinking about critical infrastructure, road connectivity, housing, all of these conversations need to happen up front. So I have talked to some people at MORPC, kind of a emerging, ongoing conversation, but I think it's important to include in our planning scenarios.
Great question.
Yeah, we've got a question online. I'll read one out here. This is for Chad Berginnis from Lillian Whitcomb. What questions does Mr. Berginnis have to improve the equitable nature of programs like BRIC and HMGP? Would a preliminary review of flood risk be appropriate, or would an overhaul be needed?
Well, I think in terms of making a program like that more equitable, and one of the policy recommendations I know ASFPM has is move towards an allocation-based model, because I think national competitive models are based on a false premise, which is that you have areas that have some level of degree of extreme risk that's higher than others, and I would argue that for 26 years we've been doing state-level hazard mitigation planning. All states, every single one, has high-level flood risk that needs to be addressed. And so it just seems like a lot of resources are in approaches like competitive versus allocation that is problematic. But I think one of the other things in terms of flood risk, and I briefly touched on it, is allow, if you're going to have a competition or you're going to use like national level data sets, allow them to be amended. FEMA had an absolute bonkers policy, in my opinion, that you couldn't supplement NRI data with better local data. Because, and I think, Kelsey, you just said that. If you know that there's gaps, talk to folks locally, develop the data, and allow it to be plugged in. Any model that doesn't do that is destined to failure.
Well, that was a great question. We're going to wrap up as we're at time. I'm going to echo Alicia, who commented that it does seem kind of dour at times and challenging. I do think this is a challenge for us to sort of step forward and spread the word, make people aware of this. I do think there's these inequities we need to be sensitive. Kelsey brought up MORPC's planning this, but the Buckeye region has a lot of Appalachian counties that are experiencing, if you look at the population projections for part of rural Ohio, we're going to be hollowing those places out while there's growing places. The resource inequity is going to be tremendous, and the consequences of this kind of a topic is going to be differentially felt. So what a great way to elevate this conversation. We're going to have a program coming up here additionally, and thank you for getting the topic going. I'm going to turn it over to Tim Haab, the Director of the School of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Kelsey, Chad, Alicia, Linda. Great program. Thanks, Eve, for being our student speaker today. Hallie's going to come up, and we have a set of certificates here for any of our presenters. And as she's passing those out, just a couple of quick comments. This is a really interesting program to me. I've been thinking about the National Flood Insurance Program since, I wrote an article back in 2006. And what's shocking to me is, and perhaps not very shocking to me, is that a lot of the same issues are still going on. Lack of data, the coordination between various groups that is needed to solve these types of problems, but also the incentives that are built into the policies around these things that don't solve the problem. We look at the types of development that we see that's allowed under the National Flood Insurance Program that can actually exacerbate historic problems. We see it here locally. We see the leapfrog type development that moves upstream. Even if the new communities are in compliance, it funnels water more efficiently downstream, which leads to problems in historically underrepresented areas. So it's really an interesting problem, a difficult problem. What I really like about this program is we have representatives from the local level up to the national level. It's going to take everybody to try to solve these types of problems, but most importantly, it's going to take data and it's going to take policy change. And those are the types of things that we can all influence from an academic perspective, but also from a practical perspective. So thank you all for coming. Students in the room, just want to encourage you to network as we have a little bit of a break here. Take the time to network as much as you can. And just a couple of quick announcements. We have our upcoming Earth Day celebration. That'll be on April 22nd. This is the Environmental Professionals Network Earth Day event. It's free to anyone who wants to attend. It'll be April 22nd in the Fawcett Center here on campus from 3:45 to 7:30. Focusing on local climate action plans in cities across Ohio. And you get to hear stories about how communities collaborate to prepare for climate-related risks. We're also pleased to announce we're going to continue our EPN summer programs. We're going to have 2 summer programs this year, one in Toledo and one in Worcester. On Tuesday, June 23rd, we'll be having Stronger Partnerships, or Stronger Together, Grassroots and Government Partnerships Advancing Community and Environmental Health. And on Friday, August 21st, Rooted in Stewardship, Wayne County's Local Food Systems in Action. We'll also have bus transportation here from Columbus, or you can meet us on site. Look for registrations to open soon on that. While we're waiting for the EPN Connect to launch on Earth Day, we encourage you to continue to stay connected with EPN by following on the LinkedIn page. And in a moment, we're going to pause for a brief break. Then please join us for our post-breakfast workshop led by professionals from MS Consultants. This session will not be live streamed, it's in person only. At 9:45, Dr. Doug Kane, Vice President of WAMO, will kick off the workshop session titled, What is Your Roadmap to Resiliency? That'll be here in the ballroom. Before we adjourn, I just want to take a moment to thank WAMO. This has been an 11-year partnership, ongoing partnership between SENR and WAMO, and it's been a great partnership, and we really will look forward to seeing what we can do to make that continue. And finally, just a quick reminder, we are a zero waste event. Any of your scarlet colored materials can go in the bins over here by the door. You can scrape your plates into the compost bin. And if you're not sure where anything goes, feel free to leave your materials on the table. And the mugs can stay on the table also. Please leave those here. I know they make really nice souvenirs, but we don't want to have to keep rebuying them. And so with that, we'll adjourn and we'll reconvene here at 9:45. Thank you all.